Good evening, everyone. Give you all a really warm welcome to our first Passion for Life meeting of 2024. It's lovely to see you here. If you've been invited and wonder what on earth your friends invited to you, you're really welcome. Please just feel at home to join in, listen tonight to our meeting. We're really pleased to have Professor Stuart Burgess with us. It's a privilege to have you here. And many of you will have seen our invitation, which highlights the fact that he's an engineering scientist from Bristol University, a fellow of Clare College in Cambridge, and especially, from my point of view, the most intriguing thing, designer of the winning transition mechanism that gave our Olympic team, cycling team, the edge at the Tokyo Olympics. And I understand it's so secret you can't tell us what you did, but it's wonderful, and we're really looking forward to exploring how an engineer comes to look at the human body and how the human body works. So thank you for coming to be with us. I will highlight a couple of notices. I'll remind you of them at the end, but we're back here again next week with ex-professional footballer Christian Diamond, and we'd love it if you would like to come along and hear his story about how he ended up having to move from professional football into the ups and downs of life in a new way and found new meaning and purpose in his life. And of course, you're always welcome to join us on a Sunday if you'd like to think about the things of God and come along and be with us. We're an informal, friendly, relevant church, and you'd be really welcome. So at the end, there are books available, which Professor Burgess has written, and they're available on the table, so please do have a look at those. And there'll also be a chance to have a cup of tea if you'd like to have some refreshment. There'll also be a question and answer time at the end. So that's enough of me, because you don't want to hear me. We'd like to hear from you. Thank you very much for coming, Professor Burgess. We welcome you and look forward to what you're going to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Last week I was in Germany. In 2 days I'll be in Ireland. Then after that in America. So it's nice to squeeze in Wales in between those venues. This is a really important, interesting topic. I believe when you look at the amazing design of the human body, it reveals not just a creator God who's designed us, but it also reveals a God who's very caring towards man. God wants us to enjoy activities like craft work, music, and sport. And so I believe when you look at the amazing design of the human body, it shows God's care, not just that there is a designer. The design of the human body also has generated quite a lot of controversy in the last 10 or 20 years, because within the scientific community, there's kind of two camps. One is like a humanist camp, people like Richard Dawkins, Stephen Jones, Alice Roberts, who argue that the human body is badly designed, not based on any biomechanics evidence, but because that's what humanism predicts. It predicts the human body should be a bad design, and they are correct. If humanism, evolution is true, the human body should be a mess, as Richard Dawkins says. But there's a second camp in the scientific community, those who do biomechanics research. I've been doing biomechanics research for nearly 40 years, and everyone I've worked with, whether they're Christians or non-Christians in the biomechanics research community, agrees that the human body is a masterpiece of design. So you do have these two schools of thought. The human body is badly designed. If you read Richard Dawkins' books, you'll see that he argues that. And the people who actually do experimental work in the laboratory, who argue that the human body is a brilliant design. So it's a very interesting controversy, not between Christians and non-Christians, but between real scientists and humanists who have this philosophy. So my interest is mainly in bioengineering and robotics. I've written quite a few papers. I've been editor of a couple of international journals. Recently, just in the last few months, I published work on a prosthetic and robotic foot. Previously worked on knee joints and hand exoskeletons, and also artificial muscle. This is where I've got my interest in this topic. We often hear claims that AI is brilliant and robots are brilliant. You often hear that because academics know what to do to get grants. To get a grant, you have to kind of exaggerate and say how great these things are. But I've worked at the Bristol Robotics Lab for decades, and it's the biggest robotics lab in the country. And robots do not have anywhere near the skill and agility of the human body. I've seen robots do this day in, day out. So there's a lot of exaggerations about what robots can actually do. It's a little bit like comparing a Ferrari with a golf trolley, comparing the human body with a robot. But as I say, academics are reluctant to admit that because that's not how you get your next grant. Here are some quotable quotes just to start with. A very famous one by Leonardo da Vinci: "The foot is a masterpiece of engineering," and he also said a work of art. And two of my colleagues, not by me, but two leading researchers in biomechanics who are not Christians, and I could find you endless quotations like this. Researchers in biomechanics singing the praises of the intricate, brilliant design of the human body. So many parts of the body work in perfect synchronization for the body to function. So I'm going to give you, I think I have 3 case studies. The first one, human feet. You may not realize it, but the most beautiful part of your body from a mechanical point of view are your feet. As Leonardo da Vinci said, they really are a masterpiece of engineering and a work of art. I won't go through all the details of this, but basically your feet are a triple arched structure, completely different to the feet of apes. Apes have flat feet, a little bit like a hand. In fact, really, apes have 4 hands, 4 arms. Very good for gripping branches, but humans are different. We have these arched feet. It makes it very easy to stand because you can feel the front of your feet, you can feel the back of your feet. With apes, they find it very difficult to balance if they're just standing on their legs. The fact that we have an arched foot means we can stand on the ball of our feet, and in almost all sports, it's extremely important to stand on the ball of your feet. If you watch a rugby player, football player, skateboarder, they know how to stand on the ball of their feet. This is why apes cannot play any kind of sport, because they can't do that. As well as finding it easy to stand on 2 legs, humans can also stand on 1 leg because you put the center of gravity through a 3-point contact on the ground. That's the perfect tripod interface with the ground. And the reason we have 3-point contact with the ground are these 3 arches. Engineers are desperately trying to copy the brilliant design of these 3 arches. I published a paper just a few months ago in Journal of Biomechanics, and our design at Bristol is one of the very latest to manage to copy quite a lot of those arches in the human feet, but we're still not doing it as much as happens in the human feet. And it's like a Roman arch. I'm sure you've got them here in Monmouth. You have a segmented arch with a keystone at the top, and the foot is just like that. It's like a Roman arch with the keystone, except it has a fantastic number of ligaments and muscles and mechanisms that are not even fully understood by scientists. So what is really special about the human foot is when you push off for walking and running, you need a very stiff foot. But when you land, you suddenly want your foot to be very, very flexible. Now, if you speak to an engineer, they'll say, well, you can't have both. It's really hard to be stiff at one minute and then flexible the next. It is one thing engineers cannot implement in robots at the moment. But your foot has a brilliant design where when you go to push off, you have, for example, a ligament at the bottom called the plantar fascia, and it suddenly tightens your arch. You also have various muscles that tighten your foot. So your foot becomes a really stiff lever when you push off. Some of those big Welsh rugby players, when they push off, they can have a force greater than 1 ton in their Achilles tendon. So the force going through the arch is absolutely colossal for a big person. So you have this super stiff arch. But then when you're landing, you then need a soft, flexible foot. So as you land, the ligament loosens at the bottom of your feet, the muscles relax. You also have a fat pad under your heel, and the 3 arches flex. And not only is there flexibility, but there's even energy storage. One of the big ligaments in particular towards the back of the foot is called the spring ligament, and it's called that name because it stores energy and it gives it back when you push off. So it's just a fantastic design, and it's so complex and intricate. Engineers have not been able to copy it. As I say, our design we've just come up with last few months is one of the most advanced for copying some of the features of the human foot. So our work and other people's work on the human foot is demonstrating the truth of what Leonardo da Vinci said, that the human foot is a masterpiece of engineering. There are some humanists like Nathan Lentz from New York City University in the United States. He's a humanist, a very dedicated humanist, doesn't like Christians, and he's argued that the human foot is a bad design. And I've been over to the United States to argue against him and to say, Nathan Lentz, he's never actually worked in biomechanics, doesn't actually understand feet, and I've explained why some of his publications claiming that the foot is a bad design, they're actually extremely mistaken. So that debate's been going on the last couple of years in the United States. But now we come on to human hands. And like feet, they are an absolutely wonderful part of your body. Very humbling for an engineer to try and create a robot with hands or an exoskeleton with hands, because when you try to create a hand, you realize you cannot begin to match the brilliance of design of the human hand. So human hands are very, very different to the hands of apes. Human hands are designed for precision and skill. An ape's hand is very, very well designed, but it's designed for something different, which is power and strength for gripping branches. Ape hands are not even flat. They can't even make a flat hand. So there are lots of unique features in human hands. For example, that apes do not have these features. We have an opposable thumb to each finger, and not just to touch, but you actually get a perfect circle. Also, we have a flexible palm that makes that possible. And not just a single pinch grip, but we have a tripod grip. Your middle finger, index, and thumb come together to hold a pen or a rod. The humanist has to say that's a coincidence, just lucky that we can do that, but I don't think it is a coincidence. We have a middle finger which locks with our wrist, and apes don't have this, which means if you apply a shear load like this, it's difficult to dislocate your fingers because you have what's called a shear key at the bottom of your middle finger, also the index finger a little bit. Engineers often use shear keys, for example, in walls and other places. We have fine muscle control. I'll say a bit more about that later, and a very fine sense of touch. If you speak to a hand surgeon and say, would you change anything on the human hand? They would say, you can't change anything. It's a perfect design, unless there's a deformity or disease or something like that. just to illustrate the incredible performance of the human hand, did you know how many stitches can be made in 60 seconds? Taking into account it takes 8 steps to make one proper stitch. And did you know that there is an Olympics for stitching? Very, very serious. You have to be very, very good to enter the Olympics for stitching. I think I could manage 1 or 2 stitches in 60 seconds. But the world record is 118 stitches in 60 seconds. That is 944 movements. I think it's held by a Dutch lady. You can see she's just about to start. The clock is on 0, and she's looking forward to this challenge. This is what I call a deliberate, purposeful over-design, which is very, very important for the whole origins controversy, because if you read a book on humanistic evolution, for example, by Stephen Jones, he's a famous humanist atheist at London University, and he has said one of the most important principles, the theory of evolution, is that it will not give you anything more than you need. So he said, you are evolved to be an ape, and you should do nothing more than ape men have been doing for thousands of years. So you should not be able to have skill in your hands, anything more than needed. And for example, according to evolution, the reason for your hand looking the way it does is to form a fist and punch someone in the face. That is what biology students are taught is the reason for our hands. And if you can play the piano and do other things, that's just a coincidence. You're not meant to be able to do that. That is one of the most important principles of humanistic evolution. But as you can imagine, the evidence doesn't really seem to support that, because our hands can actually do incredibly intricate things. And many biologists and humanists say it is a mystery. Why are our hands so skillful? Why is our brain so powerful? Why can humans do amazing things? When you look at the design of the human body, it is exactly what you would expect if God had created us to be skillful beings. But as many scientists have pointed out, the human body is exactly not what you'd expect. If we had just come from ape men, just evolved to reproduce, eat, sleep, punch someone on the nose. Actually, if you read books on evolution, a man is evolved to rape women. That's what men have been evolved to do the last million years. I don't believe in that at all. I believe we are created, designed by God to do skillful things. By the way, the reason we can form a fist is so we can hold a squash racket and play that brilliant sport. It's not to punch someone. One of the fastest pianists in the world is a Ukrainian, Lubomir, and he even in his 60s, he can play 20 notes per second. We are designed to be musicians, pianists, artists, craftswork people. That is what we're designed to do. And what is interesting is if you go back 200 or 300 years, Europe was flourishing with great musicians, great artists, because they had a biblical worldview. They believed God had designed them to do great things, and it was inspiring, and it really inspired them. One of the reasons education is going backwards today is because children are told you are an ape and your hands are designed to punch someone in the face, which is not a good thing to tell them just as they go to the playground. So in each one of your hands you have 35 muscles in each hand. Because you have 6 or 7 controlling each finger. Your index finger is controlled by 7 muscles. That is just the most astounding thing. And each muscle has around or over 100 muscle units. And your brain which has millions of nerve pathways, can control each one of those 100 muscle units individually. So of those 35 muscles, if you just take one muscle for doing one thing, the brain can activate all 100 units or just one unit. And the units are even they're not even all the same size. And the brain knows which is a small unit and a big unit. So the brain can activate a tiny, tiny force or quite a strong force. And the integration is just mind-boggling, how the nerves weave their way into every single tiny muscle unit. When an engineer thinks about that, they get faint and dizzy and just cannot understand it. And even an individual muscle unit has 500 fibers for high power and robustness. You cannot comprehend the level of integration and design. So I will just very briefly go through the anatomy of the hand. If you don't understand this at the end of this slide, don't worry. No scientist in the world fully understands the human hand. It's beyond comprehension. And in particular, the network of tendons on the left diagram, the back of the left hand, the white bits are tendons, the brown bits are the muscle, and the tendons form a fascinating network. They're not individual, and at the moment scientists don't fully understand how that network operates. So in the fingers we have no muscles. That's a brilliant design because that means our fingers are very slender. That gives us a great skill. But in order for there to be no muscles in our fingers, the muscle's got to be somewhere else, and you need very clever tendons in the fingers to connect to those muscles. And in fact, half the muscles of the fingers are in the lower arm, and the other muscles are in the palm of the hand, and there are no muscles actually in the fingers themselves. So 17 muscles in the palm, 18 muscles in the lower arm. And just a most incredible feature that you have these split tendons. When people first look at that, they say, why do you have these split tendons? That's an incredible design. The reason is, on the top of your fingers, you don't just have one set of tendons, you have two sets of tendons. I'll show you in a minute, they go to different bones. On the palm of your hand, again, you have two sets of tendon underneath your fingers. Then you have three tendons at the knuckle of each finger. Now, if you've got two tendons going on the top and two on the bottom, they have to split by each other. They start to get in the way, so they're split sideways. And it is just as if an engineer has created this whole system. An engineer has created this whole system. God is an engineer, and a very good one. So you have this tensegrity network of tendons. So your finger is like a pulley system. You've got 6 or 7 cables pulling your finger to do different things. Those tendons are guided in tunnels, lubricated. All the little tunnels are lubricated. It is the most astonishing piece of engineering which cannot be copied by engineers. I've produced a robotic hand myself, and it is so humbling because we cannot copy many of these details. So this is just one finger. This is your index finger. And notice on the top there are 2 tendons, a short extensor tendon, a long extensor tendon. The reason you have 2, one goes to the last bone, one goes to the penultimate bone. That enables you to do different things with your finger. That's why you need 2 tendons on the top. You have 2 tendons on the bottom, one going to the last bone, one going to the penultimate bone. Then you have 3 tendons so 2 on the bottom, and then you have 3 diagonal tendons at your knuckle. And incredibly, your brain, without any effort at all, will tug at those 7 tendons in an exact combination of ways to produce extremely complex motion in your finger. But you won't think about it. Your brain just does it automatically. So in a minute, I'm going to show you, with your finger, you can do a full flexion, you can do half a finger flexion, you can do a knuckle flexion, and you can do what engineers thought was impossible, but you can also do a push-retract motion. I'll explain in a minute why that is like a miraculous movement, but all of them seem very simple. I'll actually show you in a little bit of detail how this works. This is how your fingers work. See if you can follow this. So how does your finger flex like this? Well, you have a tendon underneath your fingers, and when a muscle pulls, it gets shorter, so it pulls your fingers down. So this is what happens, right? So the muscle pulls, and it pulls it down. But then a tendon on top then pulls it up. Now, this is about as much as human robots can do, and not as well as the human hand. So you have a tendon underneath, and then a tendon on top. So flex and extend. But then, as I was saying, you've got these two other tendons that don't go to the end of the finger, but go to the penultimate bone. And that enables it. Some of you may not be so good. It depends what kind of skills you've been using in your life, but some of you will be able to do a proper half extension. Because God knew we needed that for certain music and knitting reasons. But interestingly, you can also do a knuckle flexion, which is more complex because to do a knuckle tension, you have to be pulling on at least 3 tendons because you need the right tension underneath, on top, and the right tension at the knuckle. So you can do 3 kinds of flexion: a knuckle flexion, half flexion, full flexion, by tugging at these different tendons. Of course, you're not thinking about this. It happens so naturally because you've learnt what to do. But your brain is working overtime to tug these different tendons. The most impressive one is the push finger retract finger. This is an astonishing movement. It's quite hard to explain, but this is really clever because with the previous movements, it's all been complete flexion and complete extension. But in this case, you have a combination of flexion and extension at the different joints, which is a mind-boggling thing. The brain has to be extremely clever at pulling and tugging at the tendons to get this push motion, because you haven't got complete flexion, you haven't got you're combining flexion, extension at different knuckles. The brain has to work overdrive to get the right motion. But of course, when you're pressing your keypad, typewriter, you're doing this without really any effort at all. Yet it's the most complex motion. You can also do abduction, adduction with no flexion, extension. You can even do circumduction. Now, when you do this, you think, well, that's easy, I can do a circle. But when you're doing a circle, you're quickly changing from a flexion tendon quickly to the side tendon, quickly to the extension tendon, quickly to the other. In a split second, your brain is changing between 4 different tendons to do a circumduction. So, we take things for granted so quickly, but the skill involved and the precision engineering in the hand is just astonishing. And we have near frictionless joints. As you heard earlier, I work for the British Olympic cycling team. We're actually doing some of the final tests this week for the Paris Olympics, because I've worked for Rio and Tokyo, and for Paris. We're starting to work on the Los Angeles Olympics for 2028. We're just finishing tests this week for the Paris Olympics, and we're looking at some new kind of lubrication system. Shell have joined us on the project and given us a lot of candidate lubricants. And the British Olympic team have the lowest friction of any team. I'm still confident at that this year. The friction in the British bike is 25 times higher than the friction in the joints in your fingers and your knees and your foot. That is 2,500%. It's not a little bit less. It's not a factor of 2 less. It's a factor of 25 times less, which is just ridiculous because we're like 20% better than the Americans, but not 2,500% better. So we're really trying to work out how to copy what goes on in the joints. But it's extremely clever. It's a kind of elasto-hydrodynamic lubrication. Our wrist joint is a marvel of design. You have 8 bones in your wrist joint, very small joint. The wrist joint is considered the most complex joint in the human body. It's an incredibly multifunctioning joint, and yet it's tiny. It can do flexion and extension like this. It's actually double jointed because you have 2 rows of bones in your wrist, but incredibly, it has a common center of rotation. The dimensions and the radius of the bones are so exactly right, you wouldn't know that it was double jointed. It acts like a single joint, but being double jointed gives it a big range of motion. Exactly the same for adduction, abduction. It's again double jointed with a common center of rotation due to precision engineering. So what engineers tend to look at is what's called the dart thrower motion. If you throw a dart, you get a combination of adduction and flexion. So the wrist is a biaxial ellipsoidal joint. What's very clever about the bones is not only do they form these very clever joints, but they just so happen to be aligned. So you have this very efficient load path of loads going through the finger bones and then through the wrist. This is the sign of an extremely clever engineer who solves lots of problems with the same design. And even more clever, the wrist forms structures in 3 dimensions. So not only is the wrist a clever structure in the plane of the hand, but if you look at the cross-section, it forms a tunnel called the carpal tunnel, by a very clever 3-dimensional arrangement of bones. And that carpal tunnel houses, in a very safe way, the tendons to the fingers, because as I said earlier, we have half the muscles of the fingers in the lower arm, and they pass through this tunnel so that even if you bang your wrist, those tendons and the blood vessels and the nerves are protected by the carpal tunnel. So we have this multifunctioning wrist, and just most incredible design. Then thirdly and lastly, we look at a little bit of systems design, because I've just spoken of feet and hands. But it's incredible when you look at the human body as a system. It's the most incredible system, and we'll look a bit at feet and hands. So if we just stand back and do a bit of a comparison, 300 joints in the human body, around 30 in a typical robot, 600 muscles in the human body, around 30 in a robot, and then in the human body, 500,000 muscle units, each one individually wired. In the human body, we have 50,000 position sensors. We take this for granted, but one of the reasons we move so smoothly is we have just masses of position sensors, velocity sensors, 1,000 times more than a typical robot. In a human body, we have 150,000 kilometers of wiring and only 0.25 of a kilometer wiring in a robot. That's really quite staggering. You cannot comprehend the amount of wiring in the human body. So, as I said at the beginning of the talk, the human body is just on a different level of complexity and performance to robots. What I love about muscle, because I've worked on artificial muscle, what I love about human muscle, we forget it is an incredible multifunctioning part of our body. Of course, it's there to actuate joints. But what is brilliant about muscle is the way that God uses it to give shape to the body. The shape of a body is just perfect. God, not only has he created exactly the right amount of muscle, to move every joint, but it just so happens it's the perfect amount of muscle to give shape to the body. And God puts it exactly in the right place by having long tendons to connect the muscle to the joint. And it's just perfection of design. God's doing two things at once: actuating a joint, providing shape. Not only that, but muscle actually provides a protective barrier to bones and blood vessels and nerves. You know, if we get hit, we bruise, but the muscle is there as a barrier. And muscles provide a very important source of heat for blood, and they also have position sensors as well. So muscle is an incredible multifunctioning device. It's not just an actuator for joints. A sign of a good engineer is one who produces multiple functions with one design. But in the human body, we see this just unbelievable amount of multifunctioning. Well, how about our brains and the nervous system? We have a spinal cord around 12 millimeters in diameter, and we have a lot of nerve pathways going down there, millions, because, for example, on your skin, you have something like 3 million sensors, and they're all connected with your brain, and your brain knows exactly where all 3 million sensors are, which is really quite clever. Also, you have 500,000 motor pathways going down from your brain, down to the 500,000 muscle units in your body. So in your brain, you have a motor cortex with 500,000 nerve pathways going down, and your brain has a sensory cortex to receive millions of nerve pathways going up. I've done cable engineering before, and I know that engineers cannot get that many pathways through a 12 millimeter cord, maybe a few thousand, but not a few million. It's quite incredible how these nerve pathways go down the spinal cord. Interestingly, the parts of the body, like the skull, have holes in them for nerve pathways to pass through to the eyes, the ears, and other parts. My first career was working for the European Space Agency, and I did the wiring system for ENVISAT, one of the world's biggest Earth observation satellites, and I would often have to go to the structural engineers and say, "I'm sorry, but I have to put a hole in your main beam, otherwise we can't get the cable from this side of the spacecraft to that side." And they weren't very happy about that, but they had to accept that. But it had to be planned from the beginning. This is why some people believe there must be a creator God, because you can't just evolve a wiring system step by step. You have to plan the holes right from the beginning. You can't just evolve a hole when you suddenly want to evolve a wire. And the spinal column is an incredibly integrated structure that has to be planned right from the beginning. In fact, on the right is a schematic of our spinal column with, we have something like 30 odd pairs of nerve roots. This is just one. Notice how the sensor nerve bundles are neatly together in bundles, and the muscle nerve bundles are neatly together coming out. That's how it looks. If you were to look at your spinal cord, you would see very neat bundles of nerve bundles coming out, the muscle ones together, the sensor ones together. And it looks really similar to what engineers do. And engineers get their bundles through a lot of planning and very careful work. And when you look at the wiring from the spinal cord, it just looks exactly as if it was planned by an engineer who was a very good engineer. This is yet another reason why I believe that we are created by a masterful designer. An incredible feature of this is that when those bundles go into the root nerve, there is a mixing of motor nerve pathways and sensor nerve pathways, because the nerves that branch out to every part of the body need both motor nerves and sensor nerves. And it's quite astonishing how that all gets mixed together. There are just millions and millions of design details in the nervous system. When you think nerve endings go to virtually every cubic millimetre of your body, and they start from one spine and they branch out in a hierarchical way to every part of your body, you cannot comprehend the design and integration and planning involved in connecting that whole system. An engineer just wants to be faint when they start to think about that. So, standing on one leg, I'm sure most of you can still do this. It's actually a very complicated thing. Very hard to get a robot to do this. In our head, we have these balance sensors sensing position, velocity, acceleration. The brain processes in a split second. It sends down signals to dozens and dozens of muscles, mainly in the leg and the foot, and you get position feedback. And it's a very complex thing. You know, you could easily have a PhD student spending 3 years just analysing this and never really fully understanding what's going on. There's our robot trying to stand on one leg. I love running myself. Running is it seems like a simple thing, but actually it's not a simple thing. Bipedal running is an inherently unstable activity, but because of the wonderful design of the human body, it's something we can find simple and enjoy. Now, when you look at an eye like this, what do you see? Probably you're thinking, well, that's a beautiful blue eye. When I look at this, I'm not thinking that's a beautiful blue eye. I'm looking at the muscles in the eye. Because if you look carefully, you're looking at many dozens, over 100 precision muscles in that iris. If you look closely, just around the perimeter of the pupil, you can see little tiny muscles, a rim of those, and then there's another rim of muscles around the outside. So in the middle are the iris sphincter muscles. They reduce the pupil size in bright light. So in your eye, you have many, many muscles, over 100 muscles, some of the smallest muscles in the body, the most precise muscles in the body. Your eye is full of nerve endings that travel to those muscles. If you go into bright light, in a split second, your muscles activate and they squeeze that pupil. You have iris dilator muscles that open the pupil in dark light. So around the outside of the iris are the dilator muscles, around the inside are the sphincter muscles, some of the smallest, most precise muscles in the body. Engineers cannot make a camera shutter system that small and that accurate. It's far too hard. Engineers cannot copy the human eye, cannot copy this. It's just too difficult. But God has done it with precision. So the next time you look at someone's brown eyes or blue eyes, instead of looking for the colour, look for the muscles. So what happens when your arm is out, like this, and suddenly your brain tells you a fly has landed on your arm. I'm sure you've had that experience. Just think about what's happening when to make that possible for you to sense. Because when a fly lands on your hand, that fly weighs next to nothing, a tiny fraction of 1 gram. So how can your brain tell you that something has landed on your hand or arm that weighs nothing? And how can it tell you when it's landed? And also, the brain is receiving every split second millions of pieces of information. How can the brain, in a split second, go through a few million pieces of information and say, I think the person needs to know a fly has just landed at this spot on their arm? Scientists can't understand how the brain can do that. Just go through a million pieces of information and tell you you've got a tiny force on your toe or your finger or your hand. Well, on the diagram on the right, there's a red arrow, and it's showing that in each one of your hairs, not only do you have a lubrication supply and a blood supply, but you also have a nerve supply. So you have many thousands of hairs on your body. But if a fly lands on your arm, it will touch a hair, and that hair will deform by the most minuscule amount. But when it touches a hair, the nerve at the bottom of that hair, even though it's one of 3 million nerve endings in your skin, it will send a signal to your brain, and your brain will say, hang on, one of those 3 million nerve endings is sending me a signal. I think something's landed on that hair. And it will say to your thinking part of your brain, can I just make you aware that a hair has been disturbed halfway down your forearm, kind of a bit to the right, just behind the wrist, and your head will turn, and oh yeah, a fly has just landed just behind my wrist. It's the most astonishing process and not fully understood by scientists. So, conclusion. Evolution is based on humanism, not science. I've been designing robots for nearly 40 years. I've been working in academia for 30 years. I would say my biggest surprise working in academia, really big surprise, is how many academics are very sympathetic to intelligent design. People said, when you work in academia, you're a Christian, you believe in creation, you don't believe in evolution, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And I haven't had a lot of trouble. Because, firstly, most of my colleagues are very sympathetic to intelligent design. Most of them say, Stuart, I think you're right. Everything points to an intelligent designer. But I'm not going to say it in public, and don't tell anyone I told you that. It's one of the most common things I've heard from my colleagues. Even more surprising, I've gone out of my way to speak to biologists, like professors of microbiology, and I've said to them, do you really believe in evolution? These are the top biology professors. And some of them have said, no, I don't. And these are not Christians. And I've said to these top biology professors, do you believe in the so-called abiogenesis? This is the theory that life could just come from a chemical soup. And 3 professors of microbiology at my university have basically told me it's complete rubbish. These are professors of microbiology. The higher up you go in academia, the more senior the professor, the more they will say the idea that life could come from a chemical soup is complete rubbish. And I've said to them, you're not a Christian, you don't believe this. Why do you allow this to be taught in schools? And they say it's too complicated to explain. We don't have evidence. And basically, since the 1940s, the scientific community has decided we must be naturalistic, we mustn't allow God in theories, which is a completely unscientific thing to do, but because we have all agreed to be naturalistic. You're not allowed to include God. So even though we know all the evidence points to intelligent design, and even though we know abiogenesis cannot work, we cannot explain this to the students, because they'll say, well, if there's no evidence, how can you have such faith? Or how can you just rule out the opposite? So they've been my biggest surprises. So when I say I don't believe in evolution, it's not as controversial as you might imagine. According to evolution, it predicts the human body should have bad design. And that is correct. If evolution is true, the human body should be a completely messed up design. This is where I agree with Richard Dawkins. This is what he said. That's what evolution predicts. But the problem for evolution is the human body is not a bad design. And true science shows the human body is wonderfully made. By the way, Richard Dawkins once said, perhaps Professor Burgess is correct and all the rest of us are wrong, although what he doesn't understand is it's not all the rest of us. But he did say that if he's correct, then we've made a monumental error, and I agree with him on that. So now, but I hope you're encouraged that not only is there overwhelming evidence that there is a creator God, but even more importantly, God cares for man. He wants you to have great skill, to enjoy craft work. He wants you to enjoy sport. He's given you a brain to enjoy intellectual things. God has given you taste buds to enjoy food. God has given us the senses to enjoy the beauty of whales, the beauty of birdsong. We are designed bodies to really appreciate and enjoy life. And if you're interested in more detail in these things, these are two of my latest books. The one on the right, Wonders of Creation, that's co-written with Andy McIntosh. Goes into a lot of detail in creation. The most recent book I've written is actually The Gift. It's called The Gift of Sport. And this is explaining that some of the things I've been talking about. God has designed us to enjoy sports. If I'm speaking in American, I say I'm not sure if we're really designed to play American football. Rugby is a far better game than American football. And the reason I've called it the gift of sport is that God has given us various gifts. He gives us gift of music, gift of craft work, and at the end there are testimonies. Eric Liddell, the famous runner, he felt God's presence when he was really running fast and enjoying running for God. The subtitle is also How Sport Reveals the Wonder of the Human Body. This is one of the great things about sport. It shows that there is something special about the human body. In that book, I have sections on biomechanics and the science of sport, which is really interesting. It also has the history of sport. It also has fun facts, a fun section. At the end, there are testimonies, but also I go into things like idolatry and the bad side of sport, drugs and betting, and so on. So it's actually quite a big subject. So please do look at that. It makes a good gift for birthdays and things like that. So I hope you're encouraged. If you're new to coming to church, I would highly recommend you to come to services here at this place, where not only can you hear or learn about the Creator God, who not only created the world, but he's revealed himself through the Bible, and you can hear about that, but you can also learn about the way of salvation, because we live in a fallen world of sin. Each one of us has a broken relationship with God, but that can be restored through his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. So I very much recommend you to come to hear more about that here at this church.